There's great excitement in 1631 when Roger Williams arrives in Boston. Williams was one of the most celebrated theologians the Puritans had produced, young, dynamic. His sermons were being published, well received, so he's one of the leading lights of the movement. And he arrives in 1631, and almost immediately there is trouble. First, he goes to Salem. They're happy to have a minister of his caliber in Salem. But then he's a Puritan who thinks about everything. So the customary greeting was goodman. You called other men you met goodman. Well, how did Williams know you really were a good man? So he refused to call people good man because he wanted more proof that you were, in fact, a good man. Central ritual of the Christian church is to take communion. When Williams began to wonder if everyone should receive communion, because this is the body and blood of Christ. Should sinners be receiving this? So the communion line at his church became shorter because he was refusing to give communion to people who he thought might be sinners. And then ultimately the only people receiving communion in his church were the Reverend and Mrs. Williams. And then he had doubts about her, so she's not receiving communion. And it's this kind of thing that causes trouble and causes the others in the colony to say, where did this guy come from? And ultimately I should say, Williams realizes even he is a sinner. So communion must be for sinners, so it should be open to everybody. And that's even worse for the Puritans than restricting it only to the saved. And Williams is banished from the colony. He goes off and founds Rhode Island. And for the rest of the history of colonial Massachusetts, Rhode Island is seen as a place where anyone can believe anything they want, and the Puritans wouldn't want to live in a place like that. Williams does engage in trade with the Indians, and he has a history of his own, and very important probably for another course. Now, Anne Hutchinson her father had been a minister. She arrives here in the early 1630s, and she had been a disciple of John Cotton, who is another of the leading Puritan ministers who had arrived here. And Anne Hutchinson has questions about the Reverend John Wilson and how he conducts the church, and she thinks that he is preaching the wrong kind of doctrine. And she has meetings in her home after the Sunday services where she explains what the scriptural passages really meant. She is dynamic, she is charismatic, she is interesting, all of the things poor Reverend Wilson is not. So crowds gather to hear Mistress Hutchinson, and then someone in her circle gets up a petition to replace the Reverend Wilson with someone else, and also arguing that Wilson is preaching a doctrine that you can be saved by doing good works, which is heresy. Most members of the Hutchinson faction are sent into exile. Her husband, her brother, who's also a minister, they go up to New Hampshire, and she is tried by an ecclesiastical court here, which determines that she is in fact a heretic. It's a tough trial for them because she knows a lot about as much about the scripture as most of the ministers. So she is also sent into exile. She goes down to Rhode Island, too, and then winds up outside of New York, outside of New Amsterdam at Pelham Bay. If you've ever been on the Hutchinson River Turnpike, that was because Anne Hutchinson lived there, and there in 1643, she and two of her children are killed by Indians. And Governor Winthrop back in Massachusetts says, good riddance. Now, the ideas she generates, though, don't go away, this idea of salvation and where does it come from. And one of Anne Hutchinson's friends is Mary Dyer. And Mary Dyer becomes involved with the Quaker movement. And this is a movement finding the inner light within. That is, God's voice speaks to you. It's within you, and you have to silence the world to hear it. This, of course, is heresy, too, to the Puritans. They'd gotten away from England to get away from the overarching authority of the Church of England. They're coming here establishing congregational churches, but what keeps these churches together? And, of course, if each individual is looking for his or her own inner light, they don't need a church at all. And this, to the Puritan authorities, is a recipe for disaster. So Mary Dyer, with this inner voice, is banished from Boston, told if she comes back she'll be put in jail. Well, she does come back, both because she has her family here and because the inner voice tells her to come back. She's put in jail, then sent into exile again and told if she does come back to Boston, she'll be executed. And she does come back to Boston in 1660, and the inner voice has brought her back, and the authorities of the colony hang her on Boston Common for being a heretic. And one of the great ironies here is there are statues of Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer in front of the State House, two women who were one exiled and the other put to her death by the government whose descendant is in the building behind them. One of our great ironies here about the religious dissenters and how dissent can either be tolerated or accepted. Another dissenter, just to mention briefly, is Robert Cain, very devout Puritan. And Cain is a merchant, had come from England and set up, he had a shop, and he is charged with usury, with the sin of greed, actually, for selling a bag of nails and making a profit of above 5 pence. And he's fined £200, quite a significant fine for overcharging for a bag of nails, and he's found guilty. Cain is one of the great benefactors of the town. He pays to build a townhouse. He pays to establish a library. He's a very generous man, also a very wealthy man, and he's attacked for the sin of usury and actually charged in ecclesiastical court and handed an exorbitant fine, which he finds exorbitant. He does pay it. But then in his last will and testament, he writes essentially a 200-page explanation of what he has done. Now, his real hobby in life had been taking notes on the sermons and then transcribing them later on. So he is a devout Puritan, but he wonders, how can a group of ministers understand what a just price is? So Cain is thinking about the creation of an economic marketplace and also about the difference between ecclesiastical courts. And he points out he didn't force someone to come into his shop and buy a bag of nails. He told the guy what the price was, and the guy paid it. He didn't hold a gun to his head and say, you can't get nails anywhere else. He was simply doing what the market allowed. The Puritan authorities didn't want him to do what the market allowed, and Cain does die thinking a little more harshly of the Puritans, but still a very generous benefactor to the town. The will also leaves money to build a townhouse and make other public improvements in this town, which had fined him for pursuing his livelihood. So we have the Puritan movement, which calls for questioning and calls for thinking, generating these dissenters both in the theological spectrum as well as in the practical world of economics.